Hey, fifth graders, let's talk about Chapter 1 Conventions to Describe Time. This chapter specifically focuses on the usage of timelines. And so, what is a timeline? Well, a timeline is a graphic representation of the passage of time as a line. And so, on your screen, you will see a very basic timeline on ancient Egypt. And so it shows, again, a graphic representation of the passage of time as a line. And so a timeline will place related events along a line in chronological order. Remember, chronological order means the order in which the events occurred. So on a timeline, you will have a number of events that are related to one another, related to the topic, and they are placed in chronological order. A timeline can cover everything from a short period of time, like your school day, to several thousand years. So we see timelines that are just one day long, maybe the day of President Biden on a timeline. But then we could see, you know, inventions throughout history, and we see from the Mesopotamians to more modern humans. And so we can see a timeline can cover a short period of time or several thousand years. A timeline has several parts. The title, which tells you the subject of the timeline, what the timeline is about. Just like on a map, or a table, or a circle graph, or a book, right? The title tells you the subject. A timeline will have a number of events related to that subject, related to that topic. The events will have dates, and these dates are arranged from the earliest date to the most recent date. And timelines will also have intervals. And intervals, which I'll show you on the next slide, are tick marks that are equally spaced in distance and time. And intervals are really meant to organize the timeline. And so here's an example of a timeline. Here is your title, Important Events in Ancient China. And if you look in the gray boxes, there's your event, first evidence of Buddhism in China, and it also gives the date. Each event has a date. Okay. You will also see intervals. Here's one, there's one, and so on throughout your timeline. These intervals are evenly spaced tick marks. And so if you look from interval to interval, you will realize that they are 250-year intervals. They're equally spaced in distance and time. So it really organizes the timeline. So those are the parts of a timeline. It is crucial that when you examine a timeline that you first look at the title. That's the first thing you should look at so that you know the subject. What are the events related to? Periods of time. We studied these last year as well. A year is 365 days, except when it's a leap year, which is 366 days. A decade is a period of 10 years, and a century is a period of 100 years. So here are some rules when we are examining a timeline. and truly understanding the passage of time being displayed on this timeline. So here are some rules. Number one, there is no year zero. When we look at a timeline, it will go from 1 BCE to 1 CE, or 1 BC to 1 AD. There is no year zero. When we look at BCE and BC years, which we'll talk about in a moment, these years go from highest, and it's moving down, it's decreasing to 1 CE. CE and AD are starting at 1 and gradually increasing to 2023. So BCE and BC, the higher the year, the earlier the event happened. And CE and AD, the higher the year, the later, the more recent the event happened. And this is important to note. If there is no label, if the year is, let's say, 23, okay, and there is no label, you automatically can assume that it's CE or AD. Okay, that's similar to how on your test you may write 2023. Now there is no label, but we assume that it's CE AD. Now I'll explain what these labels mean. So if you look, there are two conventions for naming and numbering dates. There's a more religious convention, and that is BC and AD. BC stands for before Christ. AD, Anno Domini, which is Latin for the year of the Lord. As you can tell, this is more religious based. Most historians will use BCE and CE. This is a secular convention, a non-religious way to number and name dates. BCE stands for before Common Era. CE stands for Common Era. We are currently living in the Common Era. And so this is what I'm talking about. If you look at BC years, you can see that they gradually decrease to 1 AD. So the higher the BC year, the older the event, because we go from the left side, which is the oldest side, to the right side, which is the most recent side of your timeline. So BC years decrease, they count down to 1 AD. And AD years, they start at 1 and they count up to the current year. I kept the same diagram because look, BCE and CE does the exact same thing. BCE dates will decrease. They are counting down to 1 CE, where the Common Era begins. 1 CE, the beginning of the Common Era, dates will increase, counting up from 1 CE. So you count from highest to 1, and we're counting up until the end of time. Okay, so that's important to remember. Okay, the last concept that we need to understand is how to tell the passage of time. So how to tell the passage of time between two events. And so there is a simple rule. Same, subtract. Different, add. Same, subtract. different, add. If both events are AD, CE, you subtract them. If both events are BC or BCE, you subtract them because they're the same. If one event is AD or CE and the other event is BC or BCE, you add them because they're different. So here's some examples. The Battle of Marathon happened in 490 BCE, and the end of the Roman Republic was 27 BCE. Because they have the same labels, you subtract. So it would be 490 minus 27 to get how many years between the two events. Hope that makes sense. Let's look at the next one. The Declaration of Independence was signed 1776 CE. American women get the right to vote in 1920 CE. The labels are the same, CE and CE, so we subtract. And our label would be the number of years. Okay, let's look at this last example. The invention of the first alphabet, 1700 BCE. The invention of the light bulb, 1879 CE. One is BCE, one is CE. They are different. Different, we add. So 1700 plus 1879 will give us how many years between the two events. So again, it's important to remember the rule. Same, we subtract. Different, what do? We add. Okay, so same, subtract, different, add. That's the rule to tell the passage of time between two events. Okay, so here is a quick review of Chapter 1, Conventions to Describe Time.